Dungeon Meshi starts off as this comedic, cozy fantasy that was enjoyable to watch, and yet by the end I was so in love with its world and characters that I was begging for a season 2. It's like when a nice old lady gives you a warm, home-cooked meal that you think is just going to be comfort food, and yet by the end when you finish eating you realize it's one of the best meals you've had in a while. And much like a lot of the cooking in this show, you wonder if the old lady cooked under proper sanitary conditions, but you choose to silence those thoughts because it just tastes so good in your mouth. Dungeon Meshi manages to grip the viewer and feel high stakes while having a much smaller scope than a lot of the fantasy shows out there. There's no gigantic spells, yet there's no evil demon lord that wants to take over the world. It's just a small party delving deep into a dungeon to save their friend in need, and it is one of the best iterations of this premise that I have ever watched. So let's delve right into this hot pot of greatness that is Dungeon Meshi. The culinary theme starts off as a bit of a comedic gimmick that I thought would wear off throughout the episodes and maybe be brought back in the final episode for a nice little wholesome moment, and I was completely wrong. The only anime that I've ever watched with so much cooking was Toriko, that was all about eating, and Shokugeki no Soma, that was all about cooking and then making not so subtle innuendos while eating. In both those anime, cooking was a fundamental part of the premise, and here I was having a bit of a hard time figuring out how they would integrate cooking into this fantasy series as a part of the story, and I love the way they did it. Unlike the usual generic video game inspired dungeons, this one has a detailed, unique ecosystem with even monsters having their own food chains. The way this series uses the cooking to further immerse the viewer into the world building is just genius. And I must confess, I'm not good at cooking, nor am I really good at it, but I was always fascinated to see what wacky dish they would come up next. I was always giddy for the cooking sections, which is something I never would have thought. My favorite dishes were the living armor and the ghost sorbet. I was howling at that episode. And not wanting to spoil much, I love the way they used the cooking as an actual plot point in the final episodes. This world feels so realistic and believable even though it's a fantasy show, and that is quite impressive. Windbreaker, which is also coming out right now, is supposedly set in real life Japan. It's much more grounded in reality, and yet its setting is much less believable than this show. The culinary theme manages to be funny and bring levity to a series that actually gets quite darker throughout the episodes. It also manages to be an organic and natural way to do world building where it's really smooth, and also it is fun in itself just because of how imaginative it is. Now, some fantasy series just coast along with their awesome fantasy elements, and thankfully, that is not the case with Dungeon Meshi. As much as I like this bizarre cooking dungeon theme, to me the best thing in this show are by far the characters. This show could have gone for A, more over-the-top characters like in Shokugeki no Soma to really sell the euphoria of the cooking, or B, it could have gone for a more cozy vibe where it feels like it's a bunch of friends adventuring, and it chose option C, both at the same time. And there is something special to be said about series that have a close group of friends as the main characters. Power fantasies where the main character just flexes on everybody are fun to watch, but to me the best series are always series with strong character interactions and character development. That's what I love to watch. I really like to watch big spells go pew pew, but what really sells me on a series is always the human element. The main crew is awesome, I love their banter, and I love how each character is very distinct and plays their own role and cares in their own way. Laios is on the monster spectrum, and he is a human encyclopedia, and he is the perfect party leader for a story like this. Even though I'm not the most adept at social interactions or picking up on social cues— wait, I'm talking about Laios, right? He's the energizing force of the group, he's the one who inspires people, and his energy may be a bit clingy sometimes, but it is inspiring, and his quick thinking helps save the crew multiple times throughout the story. We constantly see very strong characters get humbled throughout the series, and yet it is Laios that shines the most with his unconventional methods. He's not the strongest, but he can get things done, and that's what really matters in Dungeon Meshi. Then we have Marcille Donato. She's Italian, as you can see by the pointy ears. She's a huge contrast to Laios in that she's very by the book and always wants to do the right thing as she learned in her academic way. Nerd! She's always hesitant to go along Laios' extravagant plans and a lot of the gourmet dining that they do, and you can see that she is much less calm under pressure. For example, whenever there's a big situation, she always just wants to blast everything with a big fireball, which, to be fair, is a reasonable strategy in a fantasy setting. Then we have Chilchuck. He is much more cynical and less optimistic than the other two, and he brings a healthy dose of sanity and maturity to this party. Throughout the series, we do see the layers of the onion starting to peel though, and he cares a lot more than he initially gives away. He's not as heartless or as greedy as he pretends to be, and he truly cares for his friends, although perhaps in his own way. And finally we have Senshi. That man has a thick, bushy, beautiful mustache, and he just wants to fill the bellies of those who are hungry with his delicious cooking, so let him cook. I love the party dynamic, I love how well they play off of each other, and I love how quickly they manage to add yet another member to the party, and how they make it seem like they've been friends for so long, and how quickly they get the audience to care. The party members help cover for each other's weaknesses in both combat and temperament. It's easy to get jaded by watching a bunch of power fantasies where the main character is always this perfect person that can do no wrong, and yet the characters in Dungeon Meshi are all flawed, and that is why I like them so much. They feel much more human. And this takes me back to something I said in my Apothecary Diaries review, which is I love weirdos as main characters, they're just so fun. Not because I can relate to them in any way, obviously, I'm super cool and well adjusted, as is anyone that does videos about Japanese cartoons in their free time. I want to see geeks geeking out over their obsession. It is so incredibly entertaining and it is such a powerful narrative tool. It allows for exposition segments that can somehow be a bit boring to be done in an organic, smooth way. For example, it is only natural that Laios, with his extensive knowledge, will talk about the monsters to his other party members. It makes the dialogue flow much smoother. And by having the main character care so deeply about something, it also makes the audience care. I always get super hyped for these fictional dishes that I cannot even imagine how they would taste like, because Laios is also super hyped. I have nothing but praise for this anime. I think the soundtrack is good, the animation is great, and you can see there's a lot of attention to detail. I love the small things like them putting the mandrake and the dog in the opening, or the multiple callbacks to things in later episodes that you thought was just a throwaway joke or something, and then you go all like, hey, I remember that. From a generic fantasy standpoint, I also think that this world is very well constructed. Both fighters and mages feel useful and relevant in combat. There's an entire economy surrounding the dungeon that makes the world feel much more alive, and the multiple races have their own strengths and weaknesses that really help spice up the cast. I'm very excited for season 2, I will definitely be watching it, and as a side note, I think this time the viewing experience on Netflix was actually pretty good. Thankfully they stopped with the batch releases, those were awful. Weekly viewing is much better. There were multiple instances in the past where I was a Netflix paying customer and I was watching anime through other means because Netflix for some weird reason chose to gatekeep me from the content that I am paying for. Netflix took away from me JoJo Fridays, and that I will not forget. Anyway, Dungeon Meshi is great. If you watched it, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you didn't, go watch it after leaving a like and subscribing. Ciao!